All right, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Ron Shaiko. I'm the Associate Director of the Rockefeller Center. And we are gathered here today to talk about the New Hampshire primary, a bit of a postmortem, at least for 3 of the campaigns. The rest live on beyond New Hampshire. I pass along the regrets from Professor Costa. She is home sick, and so she won't be joining us today, but we do have Joe Bafumi and Dean Lacy here from the Government Department. And so we're going to start off, we'll start off with Joe and then to Dean, and then I'll come back to me for a bit, and then we'll hopefully have a lot of time for questions. I mean, that's, I think, the most important piece of this enterprise today. So thank you all for coming. Please mute your phones. And when we get to the Q&A period, please wait for the microphone to come around. We've only got one today, but we'll be as quick as possible to get it to you. And so we'll turn it over to Joe.
Thank you very much. So I love talking about and thinking about the horse race, and so that's what I'm going to do today. I want to talk about who's up and who's down and why, and what it means for the general election, and of course what it means for the Democratic nomination. So we just had our New Hampshire primary, and it looks like Sanders did very well after a very good result in Iowa as well. He won the popular vote in both states. Bernie Sanders from the neighboring state of Vermont has been able to capture the far left of the Democratic Party, and he's been benefiting from the decline in support for another candidate from a neighboring state, ElizabethWarren, senator from Massachusetts. You can see in the polls, both nationally in Iowa and in New Hampshire, that as Warren's support has gone down, Sanders' support has gone up. And there's a real terrific inverse relationship you can see there. So these two candidates have been vying for many of the same types of voters, people farther to the left of the Democratic Party. And Sanders so far has won that contest. And he right now, because of his popular vote win in Iowa and his popular vote win in New Hampshire, and the fact that in an average of polls nationally, he's ahead as of very recently of any other candidate, he is, in my estimation, the front runner right now. Of course, Bernie Sanders is far left. He describes himself as a democratic socialist. People worry about whether or not he has the capacity to beat Donald Trump in the general election. And some Democrats are really worried about this, right? And so Democrats are also looking for perhaps a more electable choice, and they're looking among the more centrist Democrats for that choice. And many have found Mayor Pete Buttigieg, to be a candidate to their liking. And of course, he did very, very well in New Hampshire, coming in second. He was very close to winning the popular vote in Iowa, did win the delegate count in Iowa. And it was the momentum coming out of Iowa that helped him a whole lot in New Hampshire. And he's sort of, I think in some ways he's an accidental candidate. It's very interesting. He's in my opinion, a very interesting phenomenon. No one really talks about this much, but if you look at the polls in Iowa and in New Hampshire, Mayor Pete Buttigieg was actually losing support up until the Iowa caucus. At best he was plateauing, but he was actually losing a little bit of support. And then he comes in strong in the Iowa caucus. What explains this? Well, some of it, of course, can be campaign effects, right? He comes from a neighboring state. He may have had a whole lot of volunteers coming into Iowa to help out. There may be other kinds of smart campaign decisions he may have made. But one piece of the puzzle that no one really talks about and is interesting has to do with the 15% threshold in the Iowa caucuses. I'm not sure if all of you know about this, but in an Iowa caucus site, groups of voters will aggregate according to the candidate of their choice. If fewer than 15% at that site aggregate for a single candidate, then they will not meet the 15% threshold to have delegates assigned, which is to say that their votes essentially won't mean anything, particularly in past Iowa caucuses where they only release the results that have to do with delegate assignment. They didn't used to release the popular vote, final and initial popular vote numbers. This year they did. So those 15% or less, if they don't meet that 15% threshold, those voters have some choices to make. They can stay firm, but their votes might not count for anything, especially in the past when those numbers weren't released, those vote numbers weren't released. They can leave for another candidate. They can combine with other candidates who didn't meet 15% to create a new category, none of the above. They have they can just go home and forget about the whole thing. they have a bunch of options. Well, what seems to have happened from the data I've looked at in Iowa, Andrew Yang lost a lot of votes because of not being able to meet that 15% threshold. In his initial vote, in the Iowa caucuses, he was estimated at getting nearly 9,000 votes. In the final alignment, it was less than 2,000. He lost a lot of voters. If you look at Pete Buttigieg, he went from 37,500 to 43,200. He increased a tremendous amount from that initial to that final vote, much more than any other candidate, much more than Bernie Sanders or anybody else. Biden lost a little bit, Warren lost a little bit. Some of those people may have gone, some of those Warren people may have gone to Sanders. But Yang, the Yang gang, they did not meet that 15% threshold in many sites. They lost a lot of votes from that first to that final alignment, and a lot of those people seem to have gone to Pete Buttigieg. And in that institutional dynamic, that 15% threshold, it's hard to capture that in the polls. You don't really see polls trying to get at that. They could, but they don't try very often. And so you see him in the polls not doing very well, and then this institutional dynamic gives him a boost, a big one, that helps him to win more delegates than anybody else in Iowa. That gave him a tremendous amount of momentum into New Hampshire. A lot of people talk about Iowa being, perhaps you'll never see the Iowa caucuses be as important as they've been in the past. Well, Mayor Pete, I would argue, would disagree in terms of momentum. He got a lot of momentum coming out of Iowa, and you see the poll numbers in New Hampshire for him start to increase quite a bit shortly after that Iowa caucus. So you have Sanders coming in first in New Hampshire, you have Buttigieg after that. But people worry about both of these candidates, right? Sanders is very far to the left. He's old. He had a heart attack not too long ago. People don't know if he's electable when he calls himself a socialist, a democratic socialist to be precise. Mayor Pete is a very interesting candidate. He's quite young. He's only been a mayor. He has an interesting resume outside of public life, but he hasn't been in a high-level public office. And of course, he's in a same-sex relationship, and there are a lot of people a lot of Democrats who want to beat Trump and think maybe it'll be very tough to beat Trump with somebody who's going to be a couple, will be the first gay couple in the White House. They wonder if Americans are ready for that. And so there are a number of Democrats out there who are looking for somebody else. And I think that's why you saw Amy Klobuchar do so well. Biden, who was the presumptive front runner, who looked very strong, he seemed to implode in recent weeks. I think part of the reason why was because he just hasn't been doing very well in debates or on the stump. He was never a great communicator, but he's only gotten worse over time. And I think he had some of the same problems, if you'll remember Jeb Bush about 4 years ago, some of the same problems Jeb Bush had. He came in looking strong, he raised lots of money, he had a lot of support, but a lot of that was because he was well known. And as people learned more about him, saw more of him, saw how he did on the stump, they were less and less impressed. And that happened to Jeb Bush as well. And so like Jeb Bush, now he's got all his eggs in one basket in South Carolina, right? And he's hoping that the diversity of the demographic in South Carolina will help him. It's questionable because you already see him losing support in the polls among black voters. You see him losing support in the polls among all voters. And he's not, he doesn't seem to have any kind of any real advantage. There's nothing that's changing about Joe Biden. It's the same stuff we've already seen. So I don't see him going far, but we'll have to wait and see. Klobuchar, I think, was able to benefit from Biden not doing very well. She was also able to benefit from some other moderate candidates like Bennett not doing very well. So she came in a very strong third. She punched above her weight in New Hampshire. She did the same in Iowa. She's a senator from Minnesota. Many people think that she might be quite electable because she's more or less centrist. She comes from a state that's reddish. She does very well in some Republican parts of Minnesota. She had a very strong debate performance as well. You saw her improving up until the Iowa caucuses and punching above her weight in Iowa. And then you saw her gain a little bit of momentum out of that. But you really see her poll numbers tick up after that New Hampshire debate that many of you may have watched. She did well both in the debate and had some good coverage after the debate and took advantage in some advertising that publicized what she said in the debate, her own advertising. And with all of that, she was able to come in third and do very, very well, and is now among the top tier of candidates. Now, there are also candidates who are doing poorly. We've talked about Biden already. He's hoping to do really well in South Carolina. Otherwise, I think his effort is over. He's going to have some challenges there, as Steyer spends, a billionaire, Steyer from California, spends a lot of money in South Carolina to try and woo the same sorts of voters, particularly black voters, that Biden wants. Sanders is doing better and better with non-white voters across the country. He was not typically very attractive to them in say, 4 years ago, but he's doing better and better over time. And other candidates are chipping away at Biden's support. So I don't see things going well. I don't see things turning around for Biden, but again, we'll have to see. Warren is also not doing particularly well after Iowa and New Hampshire. I don't suspect she's going to drop out right away, but I do think that her fundraising will dry up some. I think that there'll be less momentum and energy for her. I think she peaked very early, and now BernieSanders is profiting from her losing support and is taking sort of oxygen out of the room from her. There's also a wild card candidate out there who's not in the ballot, was not in the ballot in New Hampshire or Iowa, will not be in Nevada or South Carolina, and that's Bloomberg, of course, the former mayor of New York City, a billionaire many times richer than Steyer or any of us put together probably, and with his deep pockets has been able to move very significantly up in the polls nationally and in many states, and so we have to think about Bloomberg when we think about who can win this. Bloomberg got in because he saw, I think, he saw that there's potential for a centrist candidate who's very electable. The same thing that keeps Amy Klobuchar in this race and has her doing well is what got Bloomberg into the race, even at a very, very late hour. Bloomberg potentially is that candidate if he can overcome the fact that the candidate that can beat Trump and win the nomination. If he can overcome not having been in any of these early states, that's a high bar. No one's ever done it before. Mayor, you might remember another mayor of New York City, Mayor Giuliani, tried something very similar, right? He actually was on the ballot in the early states, but he gave up on the contest. He didn't spend money or time in those states, and he was just waiting for Florida on Super Tuesday, and he just did abysmally, right? He did terribly. This is many years ago, but it did not work for him at all. He had a lot of name recognition, and he was, maybe perhaps his reputation has been tarnished recently, but back then, because of 9/11, he was a hero. He was America's mayor. It did not work for him well at all. Bloomberg doesn't come out of being mayor of New York City as much of a hero as Rudy Giuliani, but he certainly has the billions of dollars. And you may have read in the New York Times today, he's spending a lot of it, although probably not making a dent in his finances, but making a big impact in the polls to try and do well in those Super Tuesday states. It's an interesting experiment. We'll see if he can pull it off. It looks to me like we have on the front runner being Sanders, somebody who's pretty far to the left, maybe somebody who can win in the general election, even as a Democratic socialist, if he can bring in new people to vote that typically don't vote, if he can attract young folks, if he can really galvanize people who just typically don't vote. He can get turnout really, really high, as well as keep Democratic constituencies who really, really want to beat Donald Trump. Possible, but I think there are a lot of people who are skeptical, so they're looking for this centrist candidate. Who's that going to be? I suspect it'll probably be either Klobuchar or Bloomberg. We'll have to see how Bloomberg's strategy pans out. One thing that's helping out Sanders right now is the fact that you have these different moderates vying for that one position and splitting the vote. Sanders might go all the way this way, right? That's what Donald Trump did. You might remember there were many more Republicans who wanted someone other than Trump than wanted Trump. How did Trump go all the way? Well, a lot of these candidates stayed in for a while, and even as they were dropping out, there were still many in there, and Trump ended up getting the nomination. And now he's changed the Republican Party some, so they're very, very supportive. Some people have left, right? Some people have entered into the party. But the reality is, for most of that nominating process, there were more Republicans that wanted someone else than wanted Trump. The same is true with Sanders now. If Warren drops out, you'll see, and these moderates keep vying for that, being that alternative, that centrist alternative, you'll see Sanders doing very, very, very well and possibly getting the nomination. And then we'll have to see what his potential is for beating Trump. So we've got Nevada coming in February 22nd, South Carolina February 29th, very diverse states demographically. We'll have to see how these candidates do in terms of the general election. Right now, when you see Sanders being the front runner, when you see where Trump's approval ratings are, they're actually very high relative to how he's been in a very long time. In Gallup, he's about 49%, which is about where Obama and Bush were before they won their re-election bids. And when you think about the left versus moderate struggle in the Democratic Party and how that's helping Sanders, if you believe Sanders is very electable, and a lot of his supporters do, then Trump is not in a very good position right now. If you are somebody who worries about a democratic socialist, self-described democratic socialist, getting the nomination, who's quite old, who's had health issues and such, if you worry about someone like that getting the nomination in terms of his capacity to beat Trump, then this is a good time for Trump, right? Trump supporters right now are probably pretty happy. They think they can beat Sanders. So that's the kind of the lay of the land as I see it. And I'm looking forward to having a discussion with all of you and hearing some more remarks from these guys.
All right. Thank you, Joe. Pass it on to Dean.
Well, thank you. I was driving around town on Wednesday morning, feeling that kind of lonely melancholy I felt when my kids went off to college. It's lonely around here, and I miss everybody. and I hope we're a swing state again this year.
Yeah, I think.
And as all the candidates are leaving, heading off to South Carolina, I hope they're doing well. We're not going to hear from them for a while. So, I'm going to frame my remarks around just a few themes, and I'll start with the big blue ink spot up there. There's some candidate lurking behind that big blue ink spot. We don't know who it is yet. And that's kind of a Rorschach test, I guess. Some of you see Bernie Sanders there, other maybe Pete Buttigieg or Amy Klobuchar, but there's somebody behind there who's a nominee. I want to talk about 4 general themes. One is what determines vote choice in primaries versus general elections. Does the party control nominations? What is New Hampshire's unique role in this sequence of events that we call the nomination process, and should New Hampshire have the first primary? And then talk about a little preliminary survey that I did where I got some results this morning. Political scientists think of the determinants of vote choice in general elections as party first, race second, and when I say race, I mean not the contest between the candidates, but race and ethnicity. The economy third, and after that maybe candidate charisma, organization, marketability, and the other parts of the campaign. Well, if you think about those in the primaries, party gets taken away because all of the candidates are allegedly, and I do say allegedly, from the same party, though they really haven't been on the Democratic side this year, and they weren't on the Republican side in 2016. The economy also doesn't matter as much because you don't have a referendum as you do in a general election on the state of the economy. So the general election is usually among swing voters a referendum on whether the economy is doing well or not. And if it's not, you vote for a challenger. If it is, you vote for the incumbent. And if it's kind of steady state, then it's sort of a toss-up. Well, all the Democrats see the economy more or less the same way, which is, I don't think that most Democrats, I think, would describe Barack Obama as hitting a 300-foot drive off the tee and then using his 7-iron to get the ball up on the green, and Donald Trump now is putting from 3 feet and calling it a great hole, right? And he parred it. The Democrats, I think, aren't thinking about the economy as much. Then you get down to charisma, which we don't talk about much. If you read the description of the election on Twitter or social media or the news, and listen to it on the news, they're talking about, well, there's a leftist candidate, it's Bernie Sanders, and there's ElizabethWarren, just a little bit more centrist, and then you have the centrist candidates. But most of the literature on vote choice suggests that voters aren't ideologues. You don't necessarily think ideologically. And lurking behind there, I think, is some charisma. When I talk to, and charisma is hard to define. I mean, I know it when I see it. I can think of some prior presidents. I think Barack Obama had a lot of charisma, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton had a lot of charisma, you just sort of see it. I'm not sure I would have put George H.W. Bush and Jimmy Carter in that same league. And among the candidates here, some people see some as charismatic and others not. When I talk to young people about their support for Bernie Sanders, what I hear is, I think Bernie Sanders, 78, I wouldn't think of him as the kind of effervescent candidate that would call charismatic, but to young voters, he's been consistent for 20 or 30 years, which is something most politicians haven't. He's on message, he's genuine, and that's where he gets a lot of his support. You can call that charisma. Pete Buttigieg has a certain kind of charisma. Amy Klobuchar has a certain kind of charisma. Elizabeth Warren, I'm not quite sure yet. I haven't quite seen it. Joe Biden had that charisma, and I'm not sure if he's going to rediscover it, but it's there, kind of that feisty charisma. So a lot of this that we think of as ideology is which candidates have this charisma, independently of electability. So that leaves this charisma, electability, which some voters are thinking about, and also policy positions. And there's a pretty sharp divide in the Democratic Party right now on left and center-left positions, or if you are in the center or to the right, you might think of these as far left and left positions rather than left and moderate. Here is candidate choice in an exit poll. Now this slide is taken directly from 538. It's not mine, but they got the data from the ABC News Edison Research exit poll. And here's how voters from different ideological stripes voted in the 2020 primary. And I think what's interesting to look at here is Mayor Pete draws almost consistently across the spectrum from very liberal to conservative. So you see he gets 15% of people who describe themselves as very liberal, 26% of somewhat liberal, 28% of moderate, 21% of conservative. His support is not ideologically confined. Bernie Sanders' support is more ideologically confined, but also he's getting 48% among the very liberal, but still 26% among somewhat liberal, 16% among the moderates, and 11% among people who describe themselves as conservative. Klobuchar is not getting much support among the very liberal, only 9%. She's picking up more support from people who describe themselves as somewhat liberal to moderate, and she's second behind Buttigieg among the conservatives. Elizabeth Warren, even more than Bernie Sanders, is confined to the left. She's not picking up anything much from moderates or conservatives. You see Joe Biden picking up votes from moderates, so about 12% and 6% among conservatives. So it does look like there is this interesting ideological divide, but it's not exactly what I thought it would be. Pete Buttigieg is drawing across the ideological spectrum. Amy Klobuchar is moderate to right. Bernie Sanders is picking up more across the ideological spectrum than I expected, and Elizabeth Warren is kind of confined to the left lane. You can also think about what this primary and also what happened in 2016 suggest about whether the party decides. And I use the term, does the party decide, because there's a book that came out a few years ago before the 2016 election, written by some UCLA researchers led by John Zoller, called The Party Decides, about how parties structure and select candidates for their nominations. And there's nothing like real events disproving a political science thesis shortly after it's written. And I think we're clearly in a position now where the party does not decide. And in 2016, we saw that clearly on the Republican side. I think you can tell a story. I'm not saying that this is exactly true, but I think it is a compelling story that the Republican Party in a way doesn't exist now. The Republican Party in 2016 was taken over by the Tea Party, which was a remnant of the Reform Party from Ross Perot. The issue positions that Donald Trump espoused are much more like Ross Perot when Donald Trump was in fact a Reform Party advocate back in Ross Perot's day, and also Pat Buchanan and others. So Donald Trump entered the Republican primaries as a Reform Party / Tea Party candidate and won. Now, if that wasn't insult enough to the Republican Party, he now controls the base of support for almost all the Republicans in the House and Senate. I mean, I can tell you that I'm sure, and I have heard, that privately a number of Republicans who voted to acquit Donald Trump in the Senate did so out of fear and fear alone, that if they didn't, he would go back to their home states and they would be primaried by somebody who's more consistent with Trump's message. So Trump took the nomination and now controls the base that elects Republicans for the House and the Senate. This is not Ronald Reagan's Republican Party anymore on issues like trade. I would say even posture abroad, because Trump seems to want to withdraw from abroad rather than engage, and a number of other issues where Trump is not like a Republican from even 2 or 3 election cycles ago. The same thing is or could happen in the Democratic Party in 2020, when the party could be taken over by somebody who's a self-described democratic socialist, whose position is not the position that the Democrats have been winning on from Bill Clinton to Barack Obama, which has been defined by what Clinton used to call the third way, which is to be a moderate, Democrat on fiscal issues, socially liberal, don't worry about winning the white working class, instead win college-educated white voters plus people of color plus women, put together that coalition. That's the coalition that has been behind Clinton through Obama, and now BernieSanders could potentially take that coalition and move it in another direction. So the party no longer decides the nominee. New Hampshire has a somewhat unique role in setting the field. One could argue, as many people I know have, that New Hampshire and Iowa should not be first. Well, we know Iowa should not and probably will not be first anymore. The Iowa caucus, I've been wrong about a number of things before, but I think I'm going to be right about this one. The Iowa caucus is now dead. I can't imagine people contesting a caucus like Iowa or any other caucus. Now I think we'll see a revision of the nomination sequence. Now should New Hampshire be first? And people have argued that New Hampshire is an overwhelmingly white state, doesn't represent the Democratic Party, a party that's increasingly winning with the majority of its support coming from voters of color. Why should New Hampshire be first? And there's an argument there, but New Hampshire did something that I think of as a public service this year that I'm not sure that any other state would have done. And it did two things. One is it winnowed out a lot of the inexperienced candidates. That is Andrew Yang, generated a lot of excitement. Tom Steyer, he put a lot of money into the state. There was hardly a day that went by that I didn't see an ad on. You couldn't get on YouTube without a Tom Steyer ad in New Hampshire, and neither one of them did well. So those candidates without prior political experience, I think, were filtered out. And I would argue that Amy Klobuchar should have been, from the very beginning, one of the most formidable Democratic candidates. She was in the top tier. She's a senator who gets legislation passed through the Senate. She wins in a red state with larger margins than any other Democrats, including Democrats at the top of the ticket, the Democratic presidential candidates. So she was a formidable candidate from the beginning. Iowa didn't see it. New Hampshire validated it and put Amy Klobuchar where I think she probably should have been. And I don't say that as someone who's a Klobuchar supporter, but as somebody who sees her as certainly a candidate who's viable, formidable, and should have been in the top set. Had South Carolina or Nevada or any of the other Super Tuesday states come next before New Hampshire, I'm not sure that Klobuchar's status would have been validated as it has been. So in that sense, I think New Hampshire served two roles. One is to get out some of the inexperienced candidates. Another is to establish Klobuchar. And I think that's because New Hampshire has a lot of crossover voters, a lot of swing voters, and we are experienced with this kind of retail politics that candidates need in order to move to the next stage. Let me show you another slide about Klobuchar, just to continue with this story. Where is her support coming from? And this again is taken from 538. And here is the gender gap and also the college gap. So if you look at Klobuchar, she's winning women with college degrees, followed by Pete Buttigieg, BernieSanders, and ElizabethWarren. Men with college degrees, she's coming in just a little bit behind Sanders and Buttigieg. Among non-college women, Klobuchar is a little bit behind Buttigieg and Sanders. Among non-college educated men, she's running a distant third. And among non-white voters, which is only 9% of the New Hampshire electorate, she actually did, Sanders won, followed by Biden, followed by Buttigieg, but Klobuchar wasn't too far behind. So not only, I think she's probably showing that she has that ability among the candidates to reach a group of voters that Democrats feel they needed but didn't get in the 2016 election, which is college-educated women, especially in the suburbs of the big cities in states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin. And she might be the candidate who can bring them in. Finally, I want to talk about something that surprised me. I have a student, Grace here, no, who's working on a QSS senior thesis, and we have a survey of 3,600 people going in the field by a company called Lucid. It's an internet-based survey, but a random sample. Well, it's a national sample, but it's people who are recruited to take surveys over the internet. And we released it yesterday and had 300 respondents as of this morning. So I took those 300 respondents and we put a couple of questions on the survey near the end. One was, who did you vote for in the 2012 presidential election? 2, who did you vote for in the 2016 presidential election? And 3, if the election were held today, which candidate would you prefer to see win in 2020? And the results from this, you probably won't be able to see this in a lot of detail because I just took this straight off of the output from the survey, but I'll run through what it says. And I'll tell you what the punchline is. Bernie Sanders can make a case for being electable, all right? So of the 300, we're going to round off a little bit, about 300, there were 302 people who responded to these two questions about how did you vote in 2016, which is the column, and how would you vote in 2020. Now start with that second column, which is Donald Trump. 104 people in the survey said they voted for Trump in 2016. Only 89 of them, or 85%, plan to vote for him again this year, at least today. Where are the rest going? To the Democrats, including Bernie Sanders, and Elizabeth Warren. So about 3-4% to each of Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, Joe Biden, and also Mike Bloomberg. So all of them are picking up Trump voters, including Sanders and Warren, which is surprising. If you look at the Clinton voters, only 4% would vote for Donald Trump this year. So if you look, there are only 4.2% who say they vote for Trump. So let me recap that. About 15% of Trump voters say today they would vote for one of the Democrats. 4% of Clinton voters say today they would vote for Donald Trump. And among those Trump supporters who would vote for a Democrat, Bernie Sanders is holding his own. Now, what about the people who voted for another party, the 32 people here who voted for a candidate from another party in 2016? Bernie Sanders is picking up 40% of them, far more than any other candidate here, and Donald Trump isn't getting any of them. And that final column, new voters or people who didn't vote in the 2016 presidential election, Donald Trump is getting the most at 33%, but that's 2/3 who aren't voting for him, at least today, and Bernie Sanders is second with 27%. So if you think about 4 things a Democrat has to do to be electable, number 1 is turn out the base. You have to get all the Democrats excited and turning out to vote. Number 2, you have to appeal to swing voters, those independents, the voters who are up for grabs. They're probably going to vote based on economic issues, but you have to win those. 3, you have to convert those third-party voters from 2016. There's probably not going to be a strong third-party challenge, but Mike Bloomberg, we don't know what he'll do. There's probably not going to be a strong third-party challenge in 2016. So you have to win over those people who voted for Jill Stein or Gary Johnson and other third-party candidates in 2016. And then 4, you have to peel off disaffected Trump voters. And I'm not sure that Trump is winning all that 95% of Republicans that he claims he is. Even in New Hampshire, Bill Weld, even though he's from neighboring Massachusetts, but I don't even know if he was much of a factor, still peeled off over 10% of the vote. Now, take this with a grain of salt because this is one day. It's months before an election. It's only 300 people, but at least it suggests that that Bernie Sanders is doing something that, to me, I would not have expected, but we are in an era of American politics where there are a lot of unexpected things happening. So I don't discount this and following the data here. And I'll stop there.
Great, thanks. Before we open, I wanted to sort of take a little glance ahead to Nevada. I was out there last week and had a chance to talk with John Ralston, who's sort of the dean of the journalists out there, and got some insights as to how that caucus is going to be going. And keep your wits about you when we watch the results from Nevada. They're having a caucus, but they're also going to have early voting in their caucus system. So if we just take Clark County, which is about 70% of the state, there are going to be 150 caucus sites on the 22nd. Starting this weekend, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, there are going to be early voting in the state for the caucus, and they will take place in 40 sites in Clark County. Not one of those 40 sites will be one of the 150 plus sites that will be used for the caucuses. And let me read you some of the places where they're going to be caucus or early voting. The Culinary Workers Union, the IBEW headquarters, AFL-CIO headquarters, UAW headquarters, Heat and Frost local headquarters, Sheet Metal Workers Union, the State Education Association, the SEIU headquarters, and then in the employee dining rooms of the Bellagio, MGM Grand, Mandalay Bay, and Paris. 1/3 of all of the early voting sites are either in union headquarters or in places where only union members actually work. And to say that this early voting is going to take place in the exact same time across all of those 40 sites is not accurate. For instance, one of the casinos is open for one 24-hour period on Sunday this weekend, so they can catch all 3 shifts at that particular place. Now, That's how they're going to vote. Now, somewhere along the line, all of those ballots have to get back to the precincts in which they're registered, one of those 150 sites to actually count those votes in the actual caucus. So that whole voter security issue comes about. And again, they bought Shadow. The Nevada Democratic Party bought Shadow, which was the app that crashed in Iowa. They've said they're not going to use that app, but they're going to use tablets with a quote-unquote tool on those tablets to collect the votes on caucus day on the 22nd. So just a cautionary tale of things that may not go right out there. But in terms of the party having some role in the election or in the caucus, the notion that those early voting sites are not in any of 98% of all of the sites that are going to be used for the caucuses are either elementary, middle, or high schools. There are only 2 of the 40 sites that are high schools in the early voting process, and a third of those are union headquarters. So if you're a Bernie supporter, how do you look upon that? Well, Bernie does pretty well with unions, but the culinary union has already come out against him. And they're headquarters for one of the sites of actually early voting to take place. And the notion that the rest of the unions follow that union, and Harry Reid stepping in and putting his thumb on the scale for any candidate but Bernie Sanders, be on the lookout that things might not go as smoothly as we might expect in the Nevada caucuses. So there's that. The other piece is, in terms of the party deciding, superdelegates. We're getting to the point here where we're not going to get someone that's going to have the majority of the votes going into the convention as a likelihood. And then the superdelegates come into play, and where are they going to go? How many of those superdelegates are Bernie Sanders supporters? So in the end, the party may decide. So we have to keep a watchful eye on that. So that's just a little tidbit to add to think about what's going to go on. It could be a messy situation in Nevada as well. So just keep that in mind. Let's open it up for questions. Who's got a question? And again, wait for the mic. It's going to come down the stairs here. One right here.
Does Nevada have the 15% threshold,
Yes, they do.
Same as Iowa?
Yes, and on those early ballots, it's strange. In some of the early ballots, they're going to have 3 choices. And some of the early ballots, they're going to have 5 choices, when in reality, they only have 2 choices. So it's really a mess. But yeah.
Thank you, professors. One of the things that I thought was interesting, a little concerning coming out of the ABC exit polls that you mentioned, was turnout for the youngest cohort of voters in New Hampshire was down from, I think, 19% in 16 to 11% in 20, as overall turnout was, I think, a record high, or at least it surpassed the 08. What do you attribute to that, and how do you think it influenced the final results? Thank you.
So turnout, there's an interesting story about turnout. There were more votes cast on the Democratic side in 20 than in 16 or 08. But if you compare as the percentage of the number of eligible voters because the population grew, then the turnout wasn't as high as it was in 08. And turnout among young voters, it is a concern for Democrats because they have to get those young voters. At the same time, New Hampshire is not a state, and this needs to be corrected. It's not a state that allows 17-year-olds to vote in the primary if they're going to be 18 by election day. Maine and Vermont do, New Hampshire doesn't. So there might have been some voters, potential voters, who just were not eligible to vote here. That doesn't account for the turnout decline, but I think there's a lot to be done with youth turnout between now and November.
Yeah. Other questions?
As a follow-up, do you think the domicile law had anything to do with that turnout? Or?
I think it might have. Another thing, my daughter is in North Carolina, requested an absentee ballot over a week before the election and didn't get it. And if that's, you can't download an absentee ballot from the website and then print it and mail it in. You have to ask for an absentee ballot to be mailed to you. Right. And I don't know how many other people are in that position. I think there have been barriers erected to increasing youth turnout.
Hi, I'm wondering if you could comment on how that very large field of possible Democratic candidates was winnowed out even before Iowa and New Hampshire. Are there any surprises there? And does any of that bear on Iowa and New Hampshire going first?
It is surprising and concerning that all the candidates of color are now out. I mean, so Kamala Harris, Cory Booker were out. I didn't expect that. Andrew Yang is now out. And for a party that is based on people of color, to say that the diversity now is there are men, women, and there's someone who's gay, that's the diversity in the Democratic Party, at least among the candidates, is both surprising and concerning.
Yeah, I would agree. Kamala Harris dropping out, Cory Booker dropping out, those were surprises. I thought Kamala Harris was going to do pretty well, and you just saw at some point, you saw her poll numbers go down. I think part of her problem was, she was quite effective and a good communicator when running for the Senate and as a senator, but somehow running for president was not her thing. She just didn't do very well. She wasn't good on the stump, and her fundraising wasn't great. There was a debate where she did quite well, but it was a unique situation. She couldn't replicate it. So those were surprises, and you could imagine that if the first contest were South Carolina, that you would have kept some of these black candidates in. And we also just lost Deval Patrick, right? He was running. He was from a neighboring state of Massachusetts. Didn't do well here. You can imagine if the first state were South Carolina, things could be different.
And Julian Castro,
Right.
is out too.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so just as a follow-up, why could they not raise money? I mean, it doesn't take much more to stay in to Nevada and South Carolina versus to drop out before them, right? So why did they not perceive their own chances to be very good?
In each case, what I hear is there was a lack of organization and messaging within each one of those campaigns. And I think a lot of people inside the Democratic Party are saying these are all one-off events, they're all idiosyncratic, but you put a number of idiosyncratic events together and it sounds systematic. And there wasn't a consistent fundraising apparatus for all of them, not like BernieSanders, who I suspect BernieSanders is, based that he ran in 2016 and now 2020, he is pulling a lot of money that would have gone to other candidates. I mean, BernieSanders, it's not that he's taking the air out of the progressive lane of the Democratic Party, he's taking the air, more importantly, out of the fundraising that will go to that progressive ring of the Democratic Party.
Hi, why do you think that Warren lost votes where Bernie gained them? If they were both appealing to the left side, why do you think Warren failed where Bernie won?
It's a really good question, and some of you who are in my government 10 class may have remembered I was asking you guys. Sanders has been doing well, and maybe his growth in support, he just took it away from Warren. Maybe Warren's loss of support was really what was driving things, and that benefited Sanders, which it is. I'm not sure why it is that Warren peaked quite early and then seemed to go downhill. Is not something I fully understand myself. She did, she kind of emerged pretty quickly. She surprised people with how well she was doing. She was pretty good on the stump, I thought, when I saw her on C-SPAN giving speeches. She had a compelling message to give, a compelling life story. Somehow, she tried carefully to position herself as somebody on the left, clearly on the left, but more electable than Sanders, right? Someone on the left, but not a socialist. So she once said something like, "I'm a capitalist to my bones," and Sanders responded with something very frankly, saying something along the lines of, "I am not," and he's the one profiting. Why that is? I would ask you guys and all of you if anyone has their own thoughts, but maybe sometimes it's just bad timing. She peaked kind of early, and if she had only peaked closer to the Iowa caucus, we might be looking at a very different story right now.
I didn't expect her to do well, and here's why. She's from Massachusetts. When they go, New Hampshire is a neighboring state of Massachusetts, but the Boston media market that reaches New Hampshire, that part of New Hampshire closest to Massachusetts, is much more moderate to conservative. on the Democratic side, and her votes were not there. Those votes went to Buttigieg and Klobuchar. Those were going to the moderate candidates. She needed to do well up here along the Vermont border, but Bernie already owns that. So I really didn't expect Elizabeth Warren to do well because she was playing to Bernie Sanders' home state advantage. And that really needs to be the narrative about Elizabeth Warren. Get them into another couple of contests where I think there's a more neutral stage and she could do better, but she's got to avoid being labeled as the disappointment.
I had thought that her support started to erode almost immediately after she announced that her Medicare for All was going to cost $30 billion.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But Bernie's cost 50.
Right. Bernie's is possibly more expensive. Yeah, her support did erode before the Iowa caucuses, right? So something happened back then. It even started before she accused. She said that Sanders had said to her in a private meeting that a woman could never be elected, and then after the debate, we all saw footage of her telling Sanders, "Did you call me a liar on national TV?" or something along these lines. Her support started fading all before that. Was it some sort of policy element? Well, if it was, then you would think that Sanders would be hurting too. Some of it may have just been Sanders getting his footing back. Okay, so he had a heart attack, right? And he was derailed for a short period of time. People were uncertain of what was going to happen with him. He came back on the trail, very, very strong, had a very, very, very clear message and a very strong base of support that stays loyal to him. And the fact that he got his footing back may be one of the biggest reasons why Warren lost support at that early stage before the Iowa caucuses.
I also think that she was trumped. Trump went after her. Trump called her names, and that matters. That sticks. The more Trump says something about someone, even if it's a total fabrication, it sticks to people, and that's to his advantage when he does that. And I think that Elizabeth Warren carries that around with her, and will carry that around till the end of her career, of the way that she was characterized by Donald Trump. And people just, that's the first thing that comes to mind, is what the last thing she was called by Donald Trump. I think that's part of it.
Are you able to separate out the returns into Democrats and independents? And if so, does that give you any hints as to what's going to happen in Nevada and South Carolina?
Right, so Nevada, there are no independents voting. It's only registered Democrats make it into that. I was of the feeling that if John Kasich had put together a challenge of Donald Trump, Bernie would have done much better here in Vermont or New Hampshire, because those that were undeclared voters that voted in the Democratic primary that can't stand Donald Trump, 10,000 of them did. They went and voted, registered Republicans and undeclared went into the Republican primary and voted for Bill Weld. If John Kasich had been on the ticket, I would plausibly argue that 40,000, 50,000 undeclared voters would have gone in and voted for John Kasich rather than voting in the Democratic primary. And if that was the moderate crowd that went that way, I think Bernie's numbers go up as a result of that. The overall turnout in the Democratic side would have gone down, but his percentage would have gone up.
Yeah, I haven't seen the breakdown of the numbers. And when you vote in New Hampshire, you have to declare your party first.
Right.
So I haven't seen an exit poll or the raw numbers that would show what the party was going into the voting booth, whether you're an independent or a Democrat. So I don't know the answer.
Bill?
A follow-up question to that is whether there's any evidence that Republican operation in New Hampshire was encouraging Republicans or Republican-leaning independents to go into the voting places and register as Democrats and vote, and if so, whom they were pushing them towards. I've heard news reports that they're doing this down south.
What I heard on the Republican side would get Trump's numbers as high as possible. They wanted to beat McCain. That was goal number one, to get over 100,000 and become the highest vote getter in the state. So I think there might have been some strategic movement, but that was goal number one from what I understood on the Republican side.
And they did it.
And they did it.
Yeah. Trump had incredibly high turnout. I mean, there were more votes cast for Trump than any prior incumbent running for office.
Right.
And I think that reflects some anger on the Republican side about impeachment and
But
sense.
the fact that McCain had the number,
Yeah.
that's one to take down. And so that was the marching order that I've heard.
But it's a really interesting question. You can imagine Republicans trying to find where independents can vote, states where independents can vote, trying to find independents who, like Trump, voting for the weakest, the candidate they think they can beat. And maybe that's Sanders, maybe it's somebody else, I'm not sure.
Jesse Jackson won the Virginia primary in '92. And it was all Republicans going over there and messing it up because they had a convention. So they could go and just vote and do that. So it's been done.
Yeah. It's hard to see, it's hard to find a lot of empirical data to prove it, but it's an interesting question. It's been done, and maybe it's being done.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak to what you think Senator Klobuchar has to do in order to maintain her momentum in the nomination process.
I think one of the biggest things she has to do is begin to appeal to non-whites, right? She comes from a very white state. She did quite well in Iowa. She did very well in New Hampshire, and very white states. Now she's looking at Nevada and South Carolina. She has to prove, if she's going to go on to win the nomination, she has to prove that she has an appeal to a much more diverse electorate than she has so far. If she can do that, then she's viable for the nomination. She can actually win, and then I think she could beat Trump. If she's not able to do that, if she's not able to appeal to them, and she's just beginning the process of doing that, then I don't think she'll be the nominee.
And Pete's got to do the same thing. I'd be curious, Dean, on that race was your second dimension.
Yeah.
After party, would you include sexual orientation in that category?
Did not in this,
but
yeah.
in that sense, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
There were certainly there were voters who couldn't vote for Hillary because she was a woman. There were voters that couldn't vote for Obama because he was black. There are voters out there that won't vote for Pete because he's gay. The question is, who are they, and what part of the Democratic coalition might they be a part of that makes it harder for him to win a nomination?
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how that breaks out.
One comment and one question. Klobuchar basically did what she did with about half the money that the two leaders have had. So I'm curious to see whether you think the money's going to begin to flow to her and make an even playing field. So that's more of a comment there. And then second, have you seen the change in Have you seen the change in registration from Republican to Independent? In doing canvassing, I found this is only anecdotal, but there were people who had become independents, and I'm curious if that's statistically significant or just something I came across.
I don't know the answer to the second one, and my answer to your comment is I think Klobuchar's fundraising machine will pick up a lot. And one of the things that she might wait for is what happens to Joe Biden, and where does he send his support?
I will say, though, as an undeclared voter in this cycle, I got far fewer knocks on the door and pieces of mail and calls than I got the last cycle. My neighbor, literally, our doors are 5 feet apart. And his door, he's on sabbatical this term out in San Francisco. His door is plastered with stickers from all of those. My door was blank, even though I voted in the Democratic primary. So something was different this time around. Whereas last cycle, like I said, 4 years ago, I was getting all the mail from both sides. But then again, it was an open.
Yeah.
I found that.
Yeah.
It was helpful for my wife, who's registered as Democrat, but I'm registered as Independent. And they didn't even mention me.
Yeah. So.
So you mentioned the minority vote and working towards that. I read an article that BernieSanders has a very large operation in California to seek the Hispanic vote, both grassroots effort, to support him, but also getting voter registration going on in California. I wonder if other candidates have a similar process going there.
I think Sanders' campaign is better organized because he's done this before.
Right.
He also has Cornel West stumping for him in the South. And I think he has an apparatus and fundraising and support to actually win the nomination, which I wouldn't have guessed. And that's independent, even if he were, it looks like about 40% of the Democratic vote thus far is what we'd call progressive, and 60% is not. But you can win the nomination with 40% of the support, which is basically what Donald Trump started with less than that, but was able to cement the coalition by just getting enough to develop some momentum and then get a majority and transform the party. I think the two largest rallies I'm guessing here were when Trump was in Manchester, right? He was, and then Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders were at the arena at UNH. Those were two huge rallies, and AOC and Bernie could really pull in a crowd in a college town.
Can you just explain how a contested convention would work, and then maybe some predictions about it?
Maybe somewhat about it?
Predictions.
Like if it would get to that point.
Yeah,
My sense is the superdelegates don't come in until the second. It has to be undeclared or no winner chosen in the first round of voting until the superdelegates would come in on the second round.
And then the candidates that don't have enough support, they'll be dropped from the ballot.
Right.
And the other candidates will aggressively seek their support. And you can think of which candidates might not have enough delegates, might be dropped from the ballot. Maybe ElizabethWarren. Then does she send her delegates to Bernie Sanders? Joe Biden, if he doesn't emerge as one of the top 2 or 3. So I could imagine that you have Bernie Sanders, Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, none with enough to get the nomination on the first round of voting. In the second round, then the other candidates become king and queen makers. Who do they send their support to? And then the superdelegates get kicked in. When was the last brokered convention? 1952, I think, was the last brokered convention.
Very long time. But people often talk about this at about this time every 4 years, right? I think a lot of us want something unpredictable, something fun, something, especially as political scientists, but it doesn't happen very often.
Yeah. Look, in my lifetime, I've seen 2 cases where the popular vote winner didn't win the Electoral College, 2 cases of impeachment. The brokered convention's next.
Right. We're so long overdue. Well, we've reached the 6 o'clock hour. I'd like to thank you all for coming. Appreciate your time, and good luck with the rest of us.
Thank you.